Welcome to All the F Words,
a podcast where two writer friends, nearly 30 years apart, explore everything we give an F about. I'm Gabi Moskowitz.
And I'm Joanne Greene. On each episode of All the F Words, we'll focus on a theme starting with the letter F. Things like fun, focus, and felines.
We'll share stories from our lives and our distinct generational perspectives and look to the experts for insights and ideas.
Today we're talking about family functions. They're wonderful, they're horrible, and ever-changing.
We'll talk about what makes family functions challenging, how everyone's family has its shit disturbers,
how today's political polarization makes everything more volatile, and how divorce, blended families, and chosen families can add a whole new layer of complexity. So, Gabi, do your family functions tend to fall more into the wonderful or horrible category?
I would say definitely more into the wonderful. Our family functions have been pretty small for, certainly since COVID. It's generally just been my parents and my husband and my kids, and then my brother and his wife. That's usually who gets together on birthdays and holidays. And then when we go to my husband's family's house, which we've only been able to do once since the pandemic, it's also pretty small. It's just us, his parents and his brother. So, I think because there aren't a ton of people, the odds are maybe a little more in our favor. What about you?
Well, I'm thinking of sort of the totality, not so much since the pandemic, which I can see why you would think of it that way, because that's really when you've had your own family has been since the pandemic. So it's been a complete game changer. I'm thinking about all the years of family functions, and in general, for me, it falls into before they died and after they died. And by they, I mean my mother, my sister, and my brother. So, but in general, I will say that apart and aside from a few notable exceptions, family functions have been a delight. And a lot of laughter and a lot of love and a lot of sharing. And then always, your brain can go to those few times where something blew up or someone had an expectation that wasn't met, which is, I think, often why family functions become so challenging.
I definitely can think of some of those.
So I'll give you one example, and this was a family function where it was called for a certain time, and some family members assumed that meant that it was called for that time, and that we would gather, and that within a half an hour we would be eating, and that within 2 hours, max 2.5, the event would be over, and they would be able to go home. And now I'll say in parentheses, with their infant who needed to go to bed. And yet the person who said it's starting at such and such a time didn't really mean it was starting at that time, meant come and we'll hang out for 2 or 3 hours. And some of the other people might not come for another hour, hour and a half. And at that moment when you thought you'd be leaving in 2 hours, that's actually when we're going to sit down for the dinner. So misaligned expectations. I would say that's one issue. What popped into your mind?
Well, I was thinking of first of all, I must say, as a parent who is currently still chained by nap time schedule, it is very much a gathering ruiner sometimes. There are the people who get it, and the people who either don't have kids or haven't had kids for a long time, or have the attitude that she doesn't really need her nap, and it'll be fine.
Or have the attitude that kids can just sort of adapt.
Yeah,
they don't.
right.
They don't remember maybe that kids don't, or
she
that
can just lay down wherever. Yeah, no, it's absolutely. But the short-term memories that people who have had kids often have when talking about my kids is real. But what actually came to my mind was a particular Thanksgiving when there were two couples from who were related by marriage, and one of them brought up the one set was Jewish, one set was not, and one brought up that they had a very a big affinity for Switzerland, the non-Jewish couple, and they brought up something about the Swiss banks that had like Jewish gold and jewelry belonging to Jews from the Holocaust, and there were a lot of issues with Jewish families trying to reclaim their jewelry, which of course there weren't particularly good records kept of. And the non-Jewish couple was talking about how unfortunate that is for Switzerland, and of course the Jewish couple was very upset by this, and the entire room was silent. And then incredible, impeccable timing. As soon as that comment was made, my good friend from high school came over to join us for dessert. And he just walked into this awkward, silent, seething room. And yeah, that was probably the most dramatic one I can recall.
Well, as they say, there are two topics that one should avoid in mixed company, which everything pretty much is mixed company. Not necessarily true, but I digress. And that's religion and politics. And I think your two couples just like stumbled into a stew of both.
Yeah, they hit two birds with one stone, as they say.
However, I think it's important to acknowledge that even in the best of families, there are tensions. Mm-hmm. And when people, for instance, start drinking alcohol, often they get a little looser and maybe a little bit less inhibited, or maybe a little bit less controlled in their speech. And so things can spiral out of control very quickly. It seems that everyone has someone in their family who's a little bit more difficult. And that difficult can take a million different forms. It can be that they see the world differently than you do. It can be that they don't listen, that they just talk. It could be that they ask questions and then walk away before the answer. And then it can really get, for some people, into the territory of unsafe.
Well, wouldn't you say that many families have more than one of each of those?
Yes, that too. But I think for some of us, being at a family function can be almost like stepping into a minefield where, if you go over there, it can blow up in your face. And if you go over there or say the wrong thing or don't answer the question properly, I'm thinking about people, for instance, in your generation, who are constantly bombarded by people in my generation with questions that have all kinds of hidden agenda behind them. Like you get married, when are you going to buy a house? You get married, when are you going to have a kid? You're not married. Are you gay?
Yeah.
Whatever the thing is, there is this expectation that is either overtly stated or just insidiously poisoning the conversation.
Well, and I would say, in addition, depending on what sort of family function you're going to and where it's being hosted and who's there, it's not only like walking into a minefield, it's also like stepping into a time machine. I see my family pretty often. And so I think for the most part, I have been able to mostly be my actualized 40-year-old self when I'm around them. But when we're all together, there are many ways in which we fall into the roles that we always occupied of mom and dad and the two kids. And then our spouses are like trying to figure out where they fit in. And then, of course, now there are actual children running around. Certainly when we go visit my husband's family for the first couple of days, he turns into a 17-year-old. Because it's just is what happens. It's try as we might. We get cast into these roles. And I think for a lot of people, I certainly have experienced this, is all that old stuff comes up, that stuff that you don't have to confront very often because it's not in your face. Suddenly it's like all in your face at once. And if you're in a relative's home that you haven't been in a long time, it's all the old smells of childhood and the old, sometimes furniture of childhood. And it's just a whole sensory experience.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of wonderfulness about that and a lot of challenge too. I have seen my sons, who are now 37 and 40, just going right back into the poking at each other and trying to antagonize the other person. And they're so good at it, right? They've developed such skill at knowing where the other person's Achilles heel is and how to get them agitated. And there's always like a point in the evening where someone, usually me or my husband, like sort of blows the whistle and goes, okay, enough of that. That's not fun. That is not enjoyable. There are lots of specifics that experts tell us about how to deal with, for instance, annoying people in the family, and one thing is, before you go into the family function, think about what you appreciate about all of your family members rather than just focusing on the things that make them difficult to be around. And that's, you can kind of prime yourself rather than walk in and be braced for them to annoy you. Try to see the qualities in them that you really do appreciate. Being prepared ahead of time, I'm told, can help navigate difficult conversations and interactions with less stress. Also, if your family member has lived a particularly hard life, they might be struggling, they might be bitter, resentful, angry over what life has dealt them, particularly if your life's going pretty well. So instead of getting annoyed by their behavior, try to be empathetic. Try to take a look at where that person is in their life right now and what they've been through, and try to be magnanimous if you can. Just because people are family doesn't mean that you have to put yourself in a position where you're going to be emotionally abused. That's an important one. Just because you're related to someone doesn't mean they have carte blanche and that they can say whatever they want to you. So this is another really important one. There's a real difference between somebody whose behavior is annoying and someone whose behavior is actually abusive. And you need to first look at where are your sensitivities and see if you can bolster yourself up, but also pay attention to your own stress level. And if you feel yourself heating up, if you feel anxiety beginning to build, disengage. It might mean going to a different part of the room or turning to the person who's seated on the other side of you. The other thing that I learned, and I think this is a great one, is avoid trying to fix things.
Oh, that's hard for me.
Right? You sort of there is that temptation when someone's talking about what isn't going well in their life to just say, well, what about this? And you know how much you hate it when people do that to you, right?
Of course, yeah.
Because they never know the whole situation, and they're projecting their life experience onto yours. I mean, there may even be a kernel of relevance there, but it's just a kernel, and you just kind of want to smack them and say, don't try to solve my life. So I think it's equally important for us to remember not to try to solve other people's lives. That's a tough one.
I learned a good technique when it comes to passive aggression, which I think comes up a lot at family functions because everyone's trying to be on good behavior, but their feelings are all bubbling a lot closer to the surface. And that is when someone is being passive aggressive to you, I thought this was so smart. Respond only to their words. Don't respond to their tone. So if someone says, it's fine, I'm fine, I don't need any help, it's fine, then you say, okay, great, I'm glad it's fine. If someone won't if they're acting one way but saying something else, you just respond to what they're saying. And I thought that was so smart. I love having techniques and even sometimes catchphrases in my back pocket for when I get into an uncomfortable situation in a family function or otherwise, because I think sometimes it's the lack of knowing what to do that makes it so much worse. It's just the sitting in the bad feelings.
The discomfort. I have another trick for your toolbox, and that is pause before responding. That's a really important one for me because my inclination is to fill every second of silence with words. And often it's like, help, I'm talking and I can't shut up, or I'm being verbally impulsive. And so the first thing that pops into my head pops out of my mouth. And whereas if I had stopped and had an opportunity to consider the impact of my words or the potential impact of my words, I might have said either nothing, which is always a possibility. You don't always have to respond. You can nod. You can look like you're thinking. You can have that sort of reflective look on your face. Another big one is you don't have to feel the need to share. You just don't have to share. And that's a big one for me because I overshare. I guess you've noticed.
I love that about you.
In person and on this podcast, I just, and that it goes hand in hand with the whole notion of boundaries. You need to set them, said the person who never sets them. I need to set them. We need to set boundaries and know when certain topics should just be off limits. I have a really close friend whom I adore, and we disagree politically on a lot of things. And we often will, at some point in our visits, one of us will say something and then we go, do we want to go there? Do we want to do this? Do you want to take this one on? I mean, the other day she brought up CRT, critical race theory. And I said, oh, really? In the middle of our lunch, that's what you want to talk? Because I have a lot to say on the subject. and so we can actually say, no, let's not go there. You're not going to convince me. I'm not going to convince you. And we can agree to disagree and still have a wonderful friendship. And in families, I think that's even tougher because in families, whether you want to have a relationship or not, you sort of just do. The relationship is a given.
So tell me what you think about this. I have heard consistently from different groups that not confronting your racist uncle is actually a problem. Not calling out your transphobic brother-in-law is a problem. And I have struggled with this a lot because, it's a real family function ruiner sometimes to get into a fight with someone like that. But I do sometimes struggle with I don't hear a lot of, I'm very fortunate in that I don't hear a lot of terrible racism at family functions, but I've been in situations where I have, and or other sorts of bigoted speech, and I have really struggled though with not saying something, and I don't know, as much as I believe that it will certainly make the function go smoother. I do sometimes wonder is that always the best course of action? What do you think?
I'm so glad you brought this up. And after these messages, I have a lot to say on the subject. You're listening to All the F Words. We're talking about family functions. She's Gabi Moskowitz and I'm Joanne Greene. And Gabi just brought up the very tender topic of when it's appropriate, if it's appropriate, to confront. And it's not only your relatives at family functions, it's really people throughout our lives who say things that reflect the society in which we've all lived, which I would say unequivocally is one of systemic racism and white supremacy. And I don't know what the terminology is, but heteronormative-ology or whatever, that, there is a certain bias toward the largest group. And My understanding in the last few years in terms of the reading and studying and talking that I've been doing is that we absolutely, if we're going to be anti-racist, and there's really only two options here, is we are racist until we are actively fighting racism and actively trying to be anti-racist. If we're going to do that, it is absolutely our obligation to call it out when we see it. And yes, it's totally uncomfortable. And yes, it can ruin the moment. It's like you feel like you're calling someone out. You're almost embarrassing them. But I think there are ways to do it that perhaps are less confrontive or less assaultive. But I think letting it go is what we've always done in our families, and it has to stop.
I think that I sometimes feel tempted when I'm in scenarios where I hear something like that. I'm tempted to get really personal with my response to someone. And again, I really don't hear this kind of stuff at family functions very often. I'm more talking about out in the world, but I know that this is a consistent issue for a lot of people is, having racist or, otherwise bigoted relatives and struggling with whether or not to speak out. And I think that the best thing probably is to respond as much as possible to the content of what the person is saying and not to fall into the trap of getting personal about what they're saying. Because when someone is doubly under criticism, when you attack two things about someone, both what they're saying and their character, they're going to be less. I guess it'll be less likely to go well. Even and I think also having an expectation that if you are going to speak out, that it very well may not go well, because people who say the kinds of things that we're talking about are generally
it's everybody. It's just not those kinds of people, Gabi. It's all of us. I've done it and I work really hard at this, but I grew up in a system and in a culture. I'll give you a really good example of a time when I said something the other day and someone, and I'm very grateful for this person, said to me, "Is that really what you want to say?" And she was right. I hadn't thought of it that way. So my son and daughter-in-law live in a section of LA where the elementary school is really good. And as they've said to me, and I think this is an okay way to put it, people who are highly educated and of a certain socioeconomic bracket often feel that the public school in their area, in the city of Los Angeles, isn't up to par, but this particular one is. Well, I made some remark like, I'm not sure exactly what my wording was, but it was something to the effect of, they live in a neighborhood where it's one of the few public elementary schools that you can send your kids to. And my friend said, "Really?" And I said, "Oh," I realized right away, the vast majority of people don't have a choice. They send their kids to the public school in the area where they live. And my comment reflected a certain bias that everybody had this option and this choice, which of course very few people do because of socioeconomics. Now, I wasn't making a statement that was inherently racist, but it was absolutely spoken from a place of privilege.
Right.
And so I was grateful to be enlightened in that moment to alter my speech in such a way, because if I had said that in front of someone who hadn't grown up in privilege, that would be a very exclusionary comment.
It's interesting, and I think so important, the way I certainly feel like commenting on ways that, especially someone like you who is well-intended and who is wanting to be more aware and do better. I think, making making people aware of something that they said that they may not have realized was really problematic in some way is so important. I think it's interesting in the context of a family function. I would be anxious about saying something like that, even though it is absolutely the right thing to do. And I feel simultaneously, I think I just think it's interesting how the two concepts are in some ways at odds, and that's just where we are in life right now. Which, in a family function, to make things go smoothly, keep it light, keep it warm, keep it open,
be accepting. But here's the thing: you don't have to confront them right there in front of everybody else.
Yeah,
you
that's
can
true.
make a mental note, and you can say something at another time. The thing that I think is the hardest about family functions, and actually social situations in general, is humor, because so much of humor is based on making fun of somebody.
Oh, yeah.
And so jokes often veer into areas where it could potentially be offensive to someone. And then I never want to be that person who's accused of not having a sense of humor because I took it too personally when, and there are certain jokes that were really funny 30 years ago that are no longer funny, right? Because, and I really feel this way with relatives, for instance, who are my age or older and who make jokes that were acceptable at another point in time and aren't anymore. And what do you do with that? It's very awkward. I mean, I think just simply not laughing is a response.
Yeah.
Just sitting with a straight face at that moment. It's interesting. Here's a great quote. Jack Kornfield, do you know who that is? He's one of the, for those of you who don't, one of the founders of Insight Meditation and of Spirit Rock Meditation Center, not far from where Gabi and I live in Marin County, California. He said, family is one of the final frontiers of spiritual development. Mm. And I think that's really true, particularly when what you just said really made me think of that you have this delicate balance of wanting these relationships to be meaningful and genuine and honest. And yet, if you're completely honest, you're going to alienate and offend and repel your relatives, right? So it's very tricky. We take on roles, sometimes roles we want to take on. And I'm now the matriarch of my family after having been the baby of the family. So I spent the first half of my life feeling like no one took me seriously. My brother used to tell me that I would outgrow my politics. And, he's no longer here, but I know wherever he is, he knows that I haven't. And in fact, I've gotten, stronger in my political views. And now I'm the elder and in the family. And I have a nephew, for instance, who makes fun of me for composting. I mean, you can't win.
Well, that's another really interesting thing about I think to the point of the family being the final frontier of spirituality. There's a lot of, so much for me of spirituality has to do with acceptance and simultaneously wanting to the sort of I vow of this is who I am, this is what I feel, this is what I think about the world, about myself, about our family, sharing that while at the same time accepting who. It's like you don't have to accept someone's views or their treatment, but we do have to accept who someone is and accepting the emotional limits of the people that we love and the extent to which they are or are not able to change in the way that we want them to is such hard work, but it's so important, especially as, both of us are in families where this is happening. Where the roles are shifting as people have children and people get older. I have, I was always, I've always been very much an oldest daughter, getting in everyone's business and being bossy and having opinions about everything. And now that I'm a mom, I would say that that's even more so the case. But as my parents have become the matriarch and patriarch of our family, since most of my grandparents are no longer with us, as those shifts and changes happen, I have just found that total acceptance of everyone is the thing I keep coming back to.
It's critical. And I think those of us who can be flexible, who can embrace, new family members who are not from necessarily our same background, who are not the same religion, who are not the same gender or sexual orientation, and just grow a larger and larger heart and embrace differences. That's probably the best formula for maintaining peace at family functions, and just allowing oneself to have richer and different types of relationships with people who are not simply a mirror reflection of ourselves.
Amen to that.
Thanks so much for listening to all the F words today. You can find us on all sorts of social media. Gabi can tell you which ones because I can never remember to say it all in a row.
You can follow us at All the F Words Pod on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And we are also on Gmail. So send us an email. We are allthefwordspod@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you.
And let's send them to our websites too, because there's a lot more to find there. Mine is Joanne, JOANNE -Greene, GREENE.com. And what's yours, Gabi?
Well, I am not really updating either of them very often, but if you want to know more about me, you can either check out brokeassgourmet.com, which is where I have a huge body of recipes, and then GabiMoskowitz.com, which is where I do a little bit more personal writing.
Have a great week.